Thank you for joining us. My name is Bill Gillespie. I'm a board member at Old Pueblo Archaeology Center here in Tucson, Arizona, nonprofit organization that's bringing you this third Thursday Food for Thought presentation. And for tonight's third Thursday program, Old Pueblo is delighted to welcome our guest presenter, Dr. Paul Minnis, PhD. Dr. Minnis is the University of Oklahoma professor emeritus of anthropology and now living in Tucson, Arizona, where he's a visiting scholar at the U of A School of Anthropology. Paul has conducted research on ethnobotany and archaeology, especially in northwestern Mexico and the U.S. Southwest. He's the author or editor of 16 books, including 6 about Casas Grandes archaeological tradition and numerous articles. This evening, Paul will discuss 2 decades of research that he and his colleague, Dr. Michael Whalen, have conducted around the important ancient community of Paquimé, also known as Casas Grandes, one of the major pre-Hispanic centers of the U.S. Southwest and Northwest Mexico. To illuminate Paquimé's rise, its influence over surrounding areas, and its final demise. So please join me in welcoming Paul Minnis. Take it away, Paul.
Okay. Okay, I think, are we there? No,
We're there, full screen. Let's go.
yeah, but it's not, it's not advancing the slides.
It's not.
No.
Try clicking on it with your left key.
Just a second, let me try it again. I don't know, for some reason.
Okay, go ahead and stop your share and get out of full
Hold it
screen.
there. Okay, do you see, did that work?
That did work.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. And many people in the chat have said, welcome from all over everywhere, Mexico, California. And I want to say greetings from San Diego. We just drove in today, and I hope the air traffic above the hotel isn't going to be too much of a distraction. Well, it's a pleasure to talk about Paquimé. Mike Whalen and I have done an extensive amount of research, and it's a really fascinating region. What I want to do tonight is give a very short introduction to Casas Grandes or Paquimé. Most people who are listening know something about it, but I just want to do a few slides. And then I will have a couple of points I want to make about archaeology in Chihuahua that are salient for understanding the current situation of archaeology in Chihuahua. And then I want to talk about the work that Mike and I have done. There are many other organizations that have been working in Chihuahua, but I'm just going to focus on what we've done over the last number of decades. Paquimé is a very important large site in northern Mexico, perhaps the most important site, or best known site at least. It was first recorded by Spaniards in 1554, the Ibarra expedition. They were cruising around northern Mexico, and they came into the Casas Grandes River Valley and said, "Oh my God, what a wonderful valley, and look at this ruin, it's really spectacular." It was so spectacular that it was largely ignored for the next 400 years. People knew about it, but there was no really good systematic research at Paquimé for about 400 years until the joint Casas Grandes expedition. Now, I'm going to be focusing on the Medio period, the middle period, as the Peso called it. And we're going to divide it up into 2 phases. The early, which is around AD 1200 to 1300, give or take some. And the late, which is 1300 to around the end of about 1425, 1450. And there's a post-Medio that I'm not going to talk much about. And the pre-Medio period is called the Viejo period. And there's occupation extending way back into prehistory, like in the Paleo-Indian times. But we're going to focus on the Medio period. That's what Mike and I have spent most of our time on. The Joint Casas Grandes expedition is the important resource. That's where every archaeology about Paquimé or the Casas Grandes tradition begins. It is an incredible project. It was conceived and funded by the Fulton family, William Shirley Fulton and Rose Fulton. You can see them next to Charlie de Peso, who is the archaeologist in charge. And de Peso, it was a joint project between the Mamorand and the INA, the Mexican Equivalent Archaeological Institute, and its representatives is Eduardo Camboa. Jesus, sorry. And the field work and the writing was done over a 14-year period. Is really pretty amazing. It is 3,500 pages, 3,100 illustrations or figures. It weighs 31 pounds, the report. It is probably the largest archaeological project, binational archaeological project in the near borderlands ever. Oh, gosh. Well, there is Casas Grandes or Paquimé before the joint Casas Grandes expedition. And there it is afterwards. They excavated maybe about half. They started on the west and worked their way east. It was a major, major project. Now, if you look at the pre-Casas Grandes photo, it looks like there's a lot of standing structures, but those are mostly historical structures. They had to move a number of families that were living there. And by starting on the west, they removed fewer families than if they had started on the east. And just as the Ibarra expedition thought that Paquimé was something really spectacular, the excavations by the joint Casas Grandes expedition demonstrated that. The massive architecture, hundreds of rooms. And you can see in the middle picture how really large they are. They're very large rooms, incredibly massive, up to 3, maybe 4 stories tall. You can see that they aren't necessarily just simply rectangular rooms like you get up north. My apologies, Bill. The one on the upper left, I think, has 17 walls. It's pretty amazing, the architecture. Very thick, heavy adobe with a lot of caliche, so it's almost cement-like. Another factor of Paquimé which gets people's attention is the large number of ritual features. Ball courts. I mean, those are real Mesoamerican-like ball courts you see at the north. There was one at the south that was equally as large, but is partly destroyed by arroyo. There was another one that the Peso thought was a small ball court in a plaza. There are platform mounds. And so, for example, we have Mound of the Offerings, where there's some very special tombs. Mound of the Heroes. Mound of the Bird. It looks like a decapitated bird, which is probably exactly what it was. And then here's one that it was probably the 5th time I went to Paquimé, I noticed it. It's a serpent mound. In addition, there are these huge ovens. There are these huge ovens where they probably were feasting ovens. For example, this one, sorry, folks. This one right here is probably the largest roasting oven, probably for agave, in the southwest and northwest Mexico. We estimated it could have cooked about 7,000 pounds of agave, which is probably feasting behavior when people came into Paquimé as the ritual center on some frequency, once, twice, who knows, a year, we don't know. And they had large, massive feasts for the people. There is an amazing intrasite water distribution system. You can see the lower photo, there are these canals going through the room blocks where people, and there'd be opening on occasion, people could get water. There's another set of canals that took water away. Much of the water came from something called the Ojo Leño, which is a big, gigantic seep in the upper left photo. And a canal brought it to the Paquimé, and the upper right photo shows one of the 2 reservoirs that filled up, and then water came out of the reservoir into the room blocks. We were there during about a 12-year drought, and the Ojo Leño just kept pumping water out. And in fact, the modern town of Casas Grandes still uses the Ojo Leño water. What Paquimé is really known for is all the spectacular exotica. You can see in the upper left, they're excavating one of 2 major, quote, storehouses, just filled with 4 million shell artifacts, I think 50 Gila polychrome vessels, most of the unworked minerals and crystals and things were found there. Copper from West Coast, you can see the Turkey and a variety of copper artifacts, mostly crodals or bells. Fancy pottery, Ramos polychrome in the center. And what is incredible is the number of macaws, mostly scarlet macaws that are found in the tropical rainforest, and the people of Paquimé learned to grow them. and to raise them in Paquimé. And in the bottom middle picture are macaw pens. There are more macaws than I think from all other sites combined in the Southwest Northwest. They were probably, the feathers were very important because the color symbolism tends to match important color, ritual culture colors, as well as the birds, and seem to have been sacrificed often as during certain events. So this stuff is cool. This is spectacular. But we should also forget that people eat. And I do ethnobotany.
Looks like we've had a freeze here. Let me try to call him. Never mind, we'd lost you for a minute.
Okay, are we back?
We are back.
Okay. If you look at the Casas Grandes, it begins right here where the Rio Palanganas and the Rio Piedras Verdes, which come out of the Sierra Madres, form the Casas Grandes, which is fairly constricted. And about when it gets to Paquimé, the fields broaden out. It's a fabulous area today for agriculture and is a fabulous area in the past. And we don't think that's irrelevant to the fact that Paquimé became the dominant community in the Medio period world. Also up to the west are the massive Sierra Madre with the kinds of resources you have. Our argument was Paquimé is incredibly well situated for a very stable food supply, the kinds of things that they could then have feasts to build alliances with other people and build their power base. So the natural environment may not people think about like as they would the exotic artifacts, but I think it was critical for understanding Paquimé. A couple of points about Chihuahuan archaeology. It really is salient. You really need to know. In 1984, I went down to the INA, which is the Mexican anthropology agency, and to talk to the regional director. And unfortunately, Arturo Guevara, I just got a message today that he just passed away. It's really sad. He was an archaeologist who loved the North. He grew up in Juarez, and he loved the North. Anyway, one archaeologist, 2024, I asked one of my friends who's an archaeologist how many there are in Chihuahua, and he said 5. A great increase, gigantic increase. But let's compare it to north of the border. Directly north is New Mexico. The state SHPO office has a list of people who could be registered or to be principal investigators or projectors. And there are 250 people on that list. And this does not include academic archaeologists working in New Mexico, nor does it include, I think, people in government service. So they're huge numbers. And if it's only 250, the number of archaeologists in Chihuahua is about 2% of New Mexico, even though Chihuahua is about 85% the size of New Mexico. So there's a huge difference. And that when you have a small number of people working, progress sometimes can be slow. And the funding difference is probably even far greater. So that really says something about Chihuahua. Kind of related to that is how people think about Paquimé. Traditionally, people think, well, during this Viejo period, it was kind of backwater with a few pit house villages, but nothing happening. And then suddenly, kaboom, you have Paquimé. And clearly something happened, and a lot of people think it was due to stimulus from the outside, whether it be Chaco Canyon, Mimbres, West Mexico, or core Mesoamerica. Except for DePesa, who argued core Mesoamerica as being the stimulus, most of the people who are proponents for the other ones, frankly, have never worked there. And so one of the key elements, one of the things we really need to know is the local setting. How much would we know about Chaco Canyon if all we really knew about was Pueblo Bonito? We wouldn't know about outliers, the whole regional context. And so what Mike and I did is we focused on understanding the local character, the local region of Casas Grandes. We felt that was what really needed to be done. There's a lot of work at Paquimé, and there's been work in the far peripheral areas, but around Paquimé, what's happening? There's me on the left, and Mike Whalen, El Mago, the magician, on the right. He's not only an archaeologist, but he's a magician because I don't know how he keeps so clean in the field, but good for him. I'm going to talk about 5 phases of our research. And I want to emphasize there are other institutions that have been doing work in the area, but I'm just going to focus on ours so you get a sense of what we've been doing. We first started in 1989 with a reconnaissance survey, looking at sites all throughout north of Paquimé, south of Paquimé, to get a sense of what's happening, if we could get a sense. And what we find is, and this is again focusing on the Medio, and we've recorded a total of about 450 sites, 350 or so of which are Medio time period. And on the bottom right, this is what a typical little community looks like. It's probably a 10-room pueblo made out of adobe. Adobe disintegrates and it becomes a pile of dirt, and then it gets looted for pottery. And so you can see these things at a distance. Upper left, you can see effect of some of the looting. And almost all of this is just simply hand looting with shovels to sell the pottery. Sometimes most of the sites are small, like the one on the bottom right. The bottom left is one of the 2 large sites, site 204. And you can see from a distance the churned up room blocks, how large they are. So we did reconnaissance survey, and then we did a multiple years of systematic survey recording. I can't remember, something like 200 square kilometers of sites in various areas. In addition to the quote the residential mounds, the residential buildings that had collapsed into piles of dirt, there's specialized features that we would notice. On the upper left is a really nice little ball court. I think we recorded 18 or something ball courts, and they're not all exactly alike. All but one of them north. Some of them only have 2 rows of rock. Some of them are a little fancier than that. But you can see what a nice little ball court that is. On the upper right are things that we called stone special. They're really well made. What you get is the oven right here, often surrounded, but not always, with an upright rocks. And then these rocks, which presumably came from when they opened up and dug out the pit. Some of them are fancy like this. Some of them don't have the upper rows. Mike doesn't agree with me, but a number of these I think were only used once, and we have reason to think so. So we recorded something, I think about 50 of these ritual ovens. Lower right are agricultural fields, check dams, or what's locally called their trincheras, which is wall. And then there are artifacts you can get. So for example, there's a certain kind of artifact that's used from one of our sites. There is a broken macaw entrance stone. It happened to be we found a macaw on that site when we excavated. So there's not only villages, but also these special features that all over the region that we are studying. There are special clues for understanding how the ritual and political organization was in the Paquimé region.
Excuse me,
Okay.
Paul.
Yeah.
We're getting a lot of skips in your speech. You're kind of freezing up, and I'm getting a message on my screen that you have low bandwidth here. So how about if I share your slides and you can just tell me when to advance?
That would be fine. Okay.
Okay, go ahead and stop your share and I'll do that.
Okay. Okay, how's that?
Okay, give me a sec here.
Okay. I mean, people actually want to listen to this?
Well, I do. Okay, here we go.
All right, good, thanks. So you just want me to say next?
Yeah.
Okay, next.
Is that it?
Yeah. So we did a systematic survey in several areas. We did reconnaissance survey first, and then we did, and most of our work was excavation in 2 phases. Phase 1 was what we call the outer core, and you can see the 4 sites on the left are about 15 or so kilometers from Paquimé. And the last research that Mike and I did were 2 sites really next to Paquimé. You can also see that Mike and I are incredibly clever in coming for sites. Next. Okay, Al. Okay, we first started with small sites. Yes, Paquimé is a class by itself, in terms of size, but most of the sites are fairly small. And in the lower left, you can see there's a kind of a ditch by an arroyo, and the local rancher had bulldozed in the middle of this room block to build a silage pit. And this is the first excavation. It was really had profiles, which really helped us excavate. And you can see what these small sites tend to be. It'd be 231, which is the site up in the upper left, or 315, the first site we worked on. They tend to have they have Paquimé-like architecture. They tend to be very small, thin walls, unadorned, pedestrian kind of architecture. Next. Okay, Al?
Yeah, it's going kind of slow. Go ahead. Yeah, it'll pop up.
Al? Okay.
You see the slide? Yeah, I have
it's
your
on the
outer
same
core
slide.
slide here.
Oh, okay. Okay, we're
Okay.
right. This is correct now. And so we looked at small sites, and there are two really large sites in our study area. And the question was, are big sites Paquimé, or are they big small sites? Paquimé had perhaps 2,000 rooms at most. This one had 200, so Paquimé is clearly different. Even if you take a smaller number of rooms at Paquimé, it's a magnitude larger than the largest sites. This is site 204. You see the Cerro Moctezuma. I'll talk about that in a minute, but Paquimé is just on the other side of Cerro Moctezuma. And atalayas are these features on hilltops, which may have been communication shrines. And what's circled is a large room block, and there are three. That's the biggest, and there are two other smaller room blocks. There's a really nice ball court. There are two ovens. I mean, this has a complete assemblage of things, though it's not nearly as fancy as Paquimé. So it's sort of between small sites and big sites. And Paquimé, next. How are we doing? Okay. There are also so we have big sites and we have the smallest sites that we had in our survey, but there are some also very unique sites. Can you see my cursor?
No,
No?
no, it's
Okay.
on mine now
Well,
since I'm free.
okay, never mind. So I apologize for the aerial shot, but there's a site that we found, 242, which clearly was a ritual site. You can see something that says room blocks off to the right, and it's high, and when Mike and I walked on it, it's just different from all the other ones. And surrounding it are these semicircular rock piles, and which we tested, but we don't know what they are. The largest ball court outside of Paquimé is at this site. You can see where the ball court is. And at the north end of the ball court is a platform mound. It's pretty small, but keep in mind that of the 350 or so Medio period sites we've excavated, this is the only platform mound we have found outside of Paquimé. Paquimé has up to 15 of these things. This, out of 350 sites, this is the only one. This site was very, very important, and there's some other characteristics that suggest that this was a sub-regional ritual center. Okay, you can see below we're excavating some room blocks. It has the architecture of Paquimé. It's only 1 story tall, but it has these multi-storied rooms. I mean, multi-walled rooms. I wall trenched one room that had 14 rooms, 14 walls, and the walls are very, very thick, just like Paquimé, and the rooms are very large, even though it's only 1 story tall. Another special site that Todd Peitzel, who is a grad student, worked with us, did for his dissertation is Cerro Moctezuma and El Pueblito. These are sites that have been well known for over 150 years. Cerro Moctezuma is a large stone circle on the highest point just west of Paquimé. And down below at the set is El Pueblito, which is the strange little pueblo. It has unusual architecture, a really not very good location. And between the two, you can't see it here because it's in the dark. There's incredibly well worn path between the two. In addition to, there is just at El Pueblito, there is this wall, really well-made wall with an entrance in the center, the wall that goes nowhere. And one only could think there were ritual processions from Paquimé to El Pueblito going through that wall and then going up to Cerro Moctezuma. And so there are some sites that aren't just simply domestic sites, they are more than domestic sites. And there may be some others. These are the two best ones we know. Next. Okay, those are the outer sites. So we have small sites, big sites, and ritual sites to give us a sense of what's going on. Fortunately, we then wanted to look at sites closest to Paquimé. Are they like those outer sites, or are they somewhat special, being close to Paquimé and on the Rio Casas Grandes floodplain? And the road you see at the top, just above 315, is the main road between Nueva Casas Grandes and Casas Grandes. And for some reason, sites, the mounds, the domestic mounds, survived. There must have been hundreds along the floodplain. Most of them have been destroyed by land levying for agriculture, and somehow 315 survived. Barely, but it did. And we spent several years excavating that site, and then did some work at 565, which is about a kilometer south of it. It's been mucked up more by historic construction than 315, but there's still some interesting archaeological deposits. You can see the kind of architecture. It doesn't have that architecture of power that we talk about. That is the weird shaped rooms, really thick walls. But these sites tend to have more exotica, ritual exotica and such, than the sites farther out, suggesting that maybe, people living in the central area were more important, maybe because they're founder members than the people farther out. So this is the inner core. So we have this 4 sites in the outer core and 3 sites in the inner core. Next. 2 sites, excuse me, in the inner core. Next. Well, doing ethnobotany, I like farming. And so most of the best farming was the floodplains, and that would be a wonderful project for somebody to do. But in the upper left, you can see little rows of rocks, those trincheras or check dams. We record, I think, about 186 of agricultural field systems like this. Most of them are small, like that one, or the one just below it on the left is a small one, probably used by or farmed by families or some small social groups. We also did agricultural work. There's John Sandor and his late wife, Deb Muchenrath, and Arturo Marquez Alameda, testing soils. And as John said, and Jeff Holmberg worked as well. And if you get enough water, they're actually productive soils. What is interesting is upper right is a really large field. 186, 6 of them are really big. The smallest of the big ones are many times larger than the largest of the small fields. We think they're chiefs' fields. That is, fields that were controlled by leaders that were worked by the locals. Not only are they size difference much larger, but they tend to be located near these special sites. 5 of the 6 are located near special sites, and they're out in the middle of nowhere. And so we think this is the first archaeological evidence in the Southwest Northwest of chiefs fields or cacique fields. No doubt they're elsewhere. They are recorded ethnographically in the Colorado Plateau, but historically. But I think this is the first documentation of it in the Southwest Northwest archaeologically. And then we did ovens. And you can see here's an oven. This is actually one of the sites. They're incredibly well made. They not only are conical pit, but then they have a cylinder that goes down a meter, which is packed with pine wood. These things got incredibly hot, and they would cook probably enormous quantities of food. This one happening right next to a ball court. Not all of them are. And so these are not just normal domestic ovens for cooking. Probably agave. We aren't sure exactly, but we think it's probably agave. But they were very large, producing huge quantities, and they were mostly feasting. Okay, so we did the farming. And the one thing that really, this is upland farming, The next project somebody needs to do is actually look at ancient farming on the floodplain, which would have been the best farming strategy. Okay, next. Okay, the last phase is one that I'm not going to talk about because after a number of decades, I decided I wanted to move on and work a few other projects that I wanted to get done. But Mike Whalen, you should have him get a talk because he ran a couple of years of this, and that is if Paquimé just kind of deteriorated rather than was destroyed in a catastrophic attack and fire, we think that there were people still living there, and that when the elite infrastructure fell apart with all the fancy stuff you see archaeologically, people were still living in small communities. And Mike excavated a number of these, trying to see if they were proto-historic or historic. I'm not going to go into it since it wasn't my research, but you should ask Mike Whalen to talk about it. Next. Okay, so I've showed you what we're done, and now I'm just going to give you our conclusions really quickly. There is a view that people have that Paquimé area, Casas Grandes area was a backwater before the Medio, that there weren't many Viejo period sites, not much of a population. Then kaboom, there's something happening at this big site with an influx of huge amounts of people during the Medio period. We think that's not the case. The Viejo period, we think, is much more robust. There are more sites than people think. Some of them are hard to see. And of the number of period sites we excavated, we found Viejo period pit houses underneath them. So they are not visible on the surface because what is Viejo is then overlaid by a much larger Medio component. So we think there's a lot more of Viejo than people think. And so the disparity between what is presumed to be the size of the Medio period population, the Viejo population, is not as great as people think. Paquimé clearly was an important center. And one thinks a big center, big control. We think it actually actually had control of a small area, but influenced areas all over the international four corners. Okay. Why Paquimé? Again, we think it's not a surprise that Paquimé is located in a place that would have particularly been advantageous for agriculture. By building alliances, you have events, you gain power and prestige by having events, and that often requires surpluses. And they could have agricultural surpluses, we think, better than almost anybody else in the region. The Medio period begins around 1200, but its height is at the 1300. Now, if that's the case, we need to think, is Paquimé a result of the Medio period or the instigator? So people think Paquimé started and it was a center of Medio influence that spread all over the international four corners of southeastern Arizona, northeastern Sonora, northwest Chihuahua, and southern New Mexico, and extending into the El Paso area. But if the Medio period is at 1200, one could potentially think that the Medio period is there. And Paquimé didn't start it, but Paquimé used that to build its influence and power out of the Medio that was already circulating in the region. I don't know if that's the case, but given the dating, we need to consider that as an alternative hypothesis. We think the center decayed about the early 1400s. And what decayed it wasn't catastrophically abandoned or sacked. Rather, these kinds of chiefdoms are very unstable. They're based on the power and prestige and the charisma of one or two or a few people generally. And so they don't have institutions particularly of power. And so when people die or move on, the elite infrastructure, the fancy pottery, all the great ceremonies and all of that, the exotica that they're bringing in from elsewhere, all of that goes away. That doesn't mean the entire population went away. In fact, we think that there was a residual population. John Douglas has argued, and I think he is correct, that there are small historically recorded groups that no longer exist, like the Suma, who in fact were the descendants of Medio period peoples. No doubt other people in the in the Medio period moved elsewhere. But we think that in fact the groups that the Spanish first recognized when they came up and then killed off or intermarried and displaced, like the Suma, were in fact the descendants of the Paquimé. And with any archaeological tradition, there's interaction with other groups, but we think Paquimé is mostly a regional phenomenon. Things like all the stuff from West Mexico were goods brought in to build the power of and to demonstrate the power of local elites. People from outside, whether it be Mimbres, Chaco, Mexico, or core Mesoamerica, aren't the people that instigated Paquimé. And that is, I think, profoundly different from how people have traditionally viewed Paquimé. Next. Okay, just a thought. There's a lot more to Chihuahua than Paquimé and the Casas Grandes archaeological tradition. This is Cerro Huanacaña, which John Roney sort of discovered, and he and Bob Hard did an amazing project here. This is late archaic, 1500 BC, about as much construction as found at Pueblo Bonito, they estimate. This is a time when the general view is you have generally small groups of hunters and gatherers, maybe doing some casual agriculture, but moving over the landscape. And Cerro Huanacaña looks to be, they're farmers, late archaic, in a dense populated community. And this isn't the only one. So you kind of think, well, Cerro Huanacaña is there something special, and then Paquimé special, and kind of wonder, maybe we're just missing what's unique about the region in between Cerro Huanacaña and the Medio period. And I think with more research that might show to be the case. Next. Okay, well, I skipped over all the boring reasons why we came to the conclusions that we came to. But if you're really daunting, you can read it. There's a new book coming out. This will be our 4th book on our research. It's called Reframing Paquimé Community Formations in Northwest Chihuahua, University of Arizona Press. It'll be available April, in a little over a month. And is sort of our swan song, and will provide the evidence for the kinds of conclusions that we draw here. There are 2 other books I want to mention. A number of years ago, almost 10 years ago, we had an Amarin seminar of people who worked in Chihuahua to think about what we know, what we don't know, and where we need to go. And out of that came a book called Ancient Paquimé in the Casas Grandes World, and which is somewhat technical. And it is now out in paperback. They just put it out in paperback, so it's cheaper. But if you don't want to get the boring details, gory details, we did out of that seminar, we produced a book, a $20, I think it's $20, highly illustrated short book about Paquimé that abstracts all the chapters in the Ancient Paquimé and the Casas Grandes World volume, with lots of wonderful photos, particularly from the Pesos excavations. And those are two things you may want to look at. And I think that's it, Al.
Yes, it is.
It is. Okay. Any questions?
Wait a minute, before we get to that, Paul,
Oh.
thanks, great. That was really, really great. And we're gonna start getting some questions coming in. I hope we're gonna get a few, but in the meantime, I would like to ask Al to give some information about Old Pueblo's missions and activities.
Okay, let me get a little organized here. Okay, just to tell you a little bit about us, Old Pueblo Archaeology Center is a nonprofit organization, completely independent of any government agencies or major universities or minor ones for that matter. Our mission is to educate people basically about archaeology and other cultures, to foster preservation of archaeological and historical sites, and to develop a lifelong concern for the importance of non-renewable resources and traditional cultures. So some of the ways that we implement our mission is we offer educational tours. We have 4 tours scheduled here shortly. One coming up on March 1st in Tucson is going to be our usual free tour of the year, and we've already got quite a few people registered. So if you're interested in this, please send us an email pretty quickly to try to get into it. We do limit the attendance. The Vista del Rio Hohokam site is a small Hohokam village site in eastern Tucson. On March 20th, I'll be leading a tour to the Los Morteros Hohokam village site, which has one of the larger Hohokam ball courts in the Tucson area. It's actually in Marana. And to the Picture Rocks petroglyph site, which has over 400 petroglyphs. This summer, we'll get out of the hot in Tucson and go into these nice cool labs at the Tumamoc Hill and the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. We'll hit both of those in one morning and early afternoon. And then in September, we're going to be leading a tour to the Dragoon Springs Stage Station, historic site, and to the Cochise Howard Treaty site, down both in the Dragoon Mountains, the southeastern Arizona. And we do have some more tours that we're working on, so please stay tuned. We offer classes and workshops, get people educated in archaeology and ancient cultures. We do have an arrowhead making and flint knapping workshop coming up here shortly on March 8th with our flint knapping expert, Sam Greenleaf. We limit that to 6 people. We still have 5 openings for that. I'll be teaching a couple of online classes later this spring and in the fall. The one in the spring is about the Mogollon culture of the U.S. Southwest. Each of these online classes is scheduled to be 14 sessions and 2 hours apiece on Wednesday evenings. So this one's going to start in May and run through early August. And then later on in the fall, I'll be leading a second online class about the Hohokam culture of Southern Arizona. We do have an online presence besides our online courses here. We put out our quarterly newsletter, which I hope to get the next issue out here shortly. And we do a lot of advertising of events and activities coming up in the Southwest relating to archaeology and history and culture. So if you're on our email list, you will start getting, some of you have already gotten them. Twice a month, we send out an email with activities that are offered by many different organizations in the Southwest, including Old Pueblo Archaeology Center. So it's a really good source to maybe hook up with some of these activities. So if you're not already on our emailing list, you can email us here at info@oldpueblo.org and just request to be put on the emailing list. Our next third Thursday Food for Thought program, we're going to have an Acamel Adam archaeologist, Whalen Williams, speaking about an indigenous perspective on the Hohokam Snaketown site, where early on the Gila Pueblo Archaeological Foundation and then later the Arizona State Museum conducted major archaeological excavations at this large Hohokam site on the Gila River. Indigenous people sometimes have different perspectives from archaeologists on, what are the value of this? What does this tell us about the ancient cultures? And Ray Lind has actually described the work done by archaeologists at Snaketown as infamous. So just to give you an inkling of what she might be talking about, I would encourage you to sign up for that one. We do a lot of children's education programs. Most of the money that we bring in goes into our children's education programs. We have a simulated archaeological dig set up at our facility in Tucson, which is on a Tucson Unified School District property. And we bring whole classrooms of kids in to teach them about archaeology methods and the scientific method. So tonight we're kind of passing the hat, as we usually do in our third Thursday programs, asking people to help support our programs by donations, becoming members of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, and basically helping us get the word out. So I will put this information into the chat here shortly. It'll have all the links that you can click on to get to these various places. So thank you very much, and let's get on with the Q&A.
Okay, thanks, Al. I think we've given Paul a chance to cool down a little bit, towel off, and ready for some questions. So John asks, given the evidence for Mesoamerican influence, copper, ball court games, scarlet macaws, Paquimé, and sites in the surrounding area that likely derived from West Mexico, what can you tell us about the West Mexican Aztlan tradition In terms of social, religious, and political organization, how do you see its contributions fitting into your model of Paquimé?
Well, if you look at outlying areas, then clearly the relationship between West Mexico and Paquimé is much stronger than to the north with Mimbres or Chaco Canyon. There's no question there's a lot of, quote, Mesoamerican characteristics at Paquimé. It's also clear that it isn't Mesoamerican in many other ways. And so we see these as item material or ideas, ideology, that the aspiring leaders of Paquimé use um, to validate their importance. And what we don't see is that it's somebody from West Mexico coming in and setting up Paquimé. You can make the same argument for Chaco. I mean, there are macaws, there's cacao, and so is Chaco Canyon a Mesoamerican outlier? I look at the same way for Paquimé as I would for Chaco Canyon, even though it's clearly there. The West Mexican connection is very important for a lot of goods. Next, okay. I don't know if that answered enough, but it would take a long time to deal with all of it. Okay.
So Chris asked, what's the relationship of the Mogollon people to Paquimé? Any rock art around Paquimé? Thank you. Great
There is
presentation.
there is some rock art. There's Arroyo de los Monos, the monkey arroyo, which has a lot of rock art. I hate the term Mogollon. You shouldn't have asked the word. When Howery defined Mogollon, he meant it to be archaeological characteristics AD 1000. After AD 1000, he didn't want to call it Mogollon. And today, I think Mogollon is just simply this catch-all term for anything south of the ancestral Pueblo and east of the Hohokam. There's so much variability in what is defined as that big blob as the Mogollon. It's really, really complicated. And so Paquimé is often put in with, quote, the Mogollon culture area. I don't think it has that much to do with Mimbres, has with, the central Arizona highland large pueblos. So it's clear these people are interacting. People all over, ancient people, even modern peoples, interact. They knew each other, and no doubt some of the people at Paquimé were from to the north. For example, they studied isotopes and argued that about 30% of the people from Paquimé were not local. On the other hand, when they looked at the Viejo period, they found the same thing. So people are moving around. It's not clear that they're moving around anymore or coming into Paquimé any more than they were any other time. So there are interactions among them. I don't think there's a lot of cultural relationships that are completely obvious. Architecture, the pottery, etc., the exotica, art, burial practices are all quite a bit different. And if you're going to look at a place where there's a connection, as I think as a previous person said, is West Mexico. So I don't like Mogollon. There are lots of different kinds of Mogollon, and Paquimé had connections with various peoples at various times. There are Mimbres sites right near Paquimé. I mean, they knew one another. Okay, so I have a hard time answering that because I hate the term Mogollon. It isn't a people. It's just aggregate that archaeologists have thrown together.
That's what I teach in my class.
Good, thank you.
And that's a perfect introduction for Barb Roth. Now that she knows you don't like Mogollon at all. But Paul,
I like Barbara.
Barbara Paul asked, Paul, have you found evidence of trails? I'm guessing there were regularly used ones.
Sort of. We have that one at Pueblo, at Cerro Moctezuma to Pueblito, and there are others. This is one of the issues when you have 5 archaeologists working. You can't do it all. And we focused on villages. I have no doubt. In fact, Adriel Heisey flown, and there are things that look like they're trails. I have no doubt that there were trails. There may have been even ritual trails as well as sort of simply movement trails. But that's not something we focused on because you have to limit yourself when there's so little work being done. So I have no doubt that they're there. And if you want to get one of your students to go, great, go for it, Barb.
Hey, Bill, you kind of skipped over the rock art of the previous question.
Oh,
There
yeah,
is rock
briefly.
art.
Yeah, we did. We got that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Kyle asked, what do you suppose the residual population did with the store of valuables like the shells, minerals, ceramics, etc.?
Probably not much. Uh, these may, and this is all conjecture, these things may have been incredibly powerful, and they may not have wanted to have anything to do with them. You know, they may have been incredibly important to the leaders and other people at Paquimé, but the residual population, if in fact the elite superstructure and religious ideology and everything kind of fell apart, these things may be seriously powerful and they don't want to deal with them. There are lots of possibilities. That's one I could think of.
Good. So Art Folks ask, could you expand on the nature of the exotics at the outlier large site in comparison with the massive amount that was present at Paquimé?
There is not the amount of exotica nearly as much as Paquimé. What I think a lot of that stuff is I think they are offerings. People are coming in from the outlying areas for these important ritual and with political events, and they need to bring offerings. And what you find in those big rooms are kind of the cheapest the cheapest um, shell and unworked minerals, the kinds of things people would find or people in outlying areas would have access to. So you find very little shell at the outlying sites. We find one macaw in our excavations. There are some macaw pens, but not that many. Clearly, Paquimé stands out. One at site 204, that big site, before we worked there, Dave Phillips found a copper bell on the surface. So these things are out there somewhat, but there's nothing compared to Paquimé. On the other hand, if they excavated those two rooms, the quote warehouses, we wouldn't have known it. And so we did pieces, since there's so little work, you have to do pieces of different, we decided to do pieces of different kinds of sites to get an idea about how it's structured, as to offer a hypothesis or a foundation how we think Paquimé is. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. When we have 5 rooms at a small outlying site, that's what we have, but clearly we need bigger sample sizes. But you can only do so much. So I don't know, Art, if that answered your question. You find some stuff, generally find not much shell. You find occasional exotica, but nothing like what you would get at Paquimé. I mean, there's no comparison at all. I think, in fact, in shell, I think they're sucking all the shell out of the outlying areas for offerings.
Are there any LiDAR studies, Paquimé region?
No,
That's too
somebody
bad.
has to do them. And who's going to pay for it and who's going to do it? Right now, I don't think there are many archaeologists working in Paquimé. Eduardo Gamboa is excavating a room right now, but that keeps him busy. Um, you know,
Yeah, I guess
this
you
is one
don't
of the
have the
consequences when there are 5
USGS.
archaeologists.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and the
that
USGS
could be.
isn't flying over there.
Well, that would be good, and somebody ought to take that data. I've done my 4 day.
Okay,
So there's a lot to do.
Joyce says, very interesting. Thank you. The place Pueblocito at the point of the hill, does it have views towards special places, other sites maybe? It also looks like it
Um,
had views over a wide area. Any
it
sight
did.
lines?
I had a student, one of my master's students, Steve Swanson. He and his partner climbed 50 hills one summer and mapped, and the things that had atalayas had a higher percentage of visibility than sites with hills without atalayas, suggesting there's something going on. And I think whether it's just communication or shrines, it could be both. I think communication makes sense. So atalayas, hills with atalayas have greater intervisibility with other hills with atalayas. And so there's something going on there. They're just not up on the top of a hill randomly. And Cerro Moctezuma is probably the center of it. Whether it was a fire communication system, some other kind of, communication system, or a shrine, and I think it's probably both. It's time to come in, guys, for this big festival. Come on.
She also asked, are there any sight lines that maybe would be calendar markers, point towards calendar markers?
Well, there is, the best known is Mount of the Cross at Paquimé, which lines up with the spring equinox. So that's pretty clear. In terms of others, I'm no doubt there is. I mean, most indigenous peoples, and we have examples all over the Southwest and Northwest Mexico where people, have those kinds of alignments. That wasn't something we focused on, and I no doubt they're there, but that's not something we focused on. So yes, that would be another wonderful study to look at.
Lots of wonderful studies waiting out there.
There is, and it's a wonderful place to work.
So Lynn's notes that you indicated both ball courts and platform mounds at the same sites. Were those constructed contemporaneously or sequentially, like with ball courts first and platform mounds second?
Well, it's not like the HOCOM. It's hard to date a ball court when they're found on the same site. They're Medio. They could be one is earlier, one's later. I think they're probably the same time. So when you're having ritual events at ball courts, you also, in some cases, have feasting ovens. So there's not a HOCOM where you clearly see it's sequential. You don't have that kind of dating precision. I would think they're both Medio, and whether they're early or both late, they're probably late, but I don't know if we can say for sure. They're very difficult to date.
Dave Siegel asked, is there any evidence of prehistoric roads in the Paquimé area?
No, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're out there. That hasn't been the research focus of any groups that I know who've been working down there. I wouldn't be surprised if they're there. Bill, how many centuries was it before roads at Chaco became recognized as something important?
Well, I think it was recognized back in the early 20th century, but it wasn't until the 1970s and Gwen Vivian and Gordon Vivian said, oh, there's something going on here.
Yeah, so I have no doubt that this is one of the other things that you got 5 people working in Chihuahua. It's time, archaeologists and maybe some foreigners. There's only so much you can do, and that's again another topic that would be a very valuable and interesting thing to look at.
So Andrew says, your research is focused admirably on the Paquimé region. To understand the context in which Paquimé emerged, do you think there's more to be learned by excavating at Paquimé proper, or any such excavations in the works? Thank you.
There is a room that is being destroyed by erosion, and Eduardo Gamboa is excavating the one room right now. It's like 2 stories tall. Yes, there's God knows what's under this stuff that hasn't been excavated. And yes, it would be nice. The question is how much it would cost. I mean, you can imagine how many tens of millions of dollars it would take to do that kind of work. And I don't know where you could get that kind of money. So yes. And another thing is, I think, and Mike Searcy, who is working down at Paquimé, I think, and he's hoping to get a project, is there a Viejo period site, big Viejo period site under Medio Paquimé? There are some Viejo pit houses, but how extensive are there? My guess is there's actually a pretty darn big Viejo period village underneath Paquimé. Think about the logistics of excavating that, answering that question. So again, there's all kinds of wonderful things. We felt when we started, look, we know something about the center. It may not be a perfect sample, but we know something about it. What we don't know is about its regional context. And that's why we focused on that. And we spent pretty much 4 decades with that simple question. Maybe if we were smarter, we could have done it in 2 decades.
Okay, any direct or indirect connections with the Hokan?
Not particularly. No, I mean, you don't get a lot of HOCOM artifacts. You have real ball courts at Paquimé, unlike those things in the HOCOM area.
Ooh, ouch, that hurt.
Ouch, ouch. So no, there's no, I have no doubt that the people of Paquimé interacted with contemporary peoples in the Phoenix Basin and knew about them. They knew about the folks at Chaco. But you know, there's no great strong connection. By the way, there's some DNA work coming out, and they have DNA remains analyses of even some of the elites, or what are the presumed burial elites at Paquimé, and it's going to be really add incredible knowledge about Paquimé. Are the role of outsiders? Are the elites outsiders? Or are they locals? Just
Yeah,
like
they
those.
just had.
Hmm?
Oh, I was just going to say, Jacob Siddick gave a talk about the DNA
Yeah.
research there. It was really good. And
You know, it's
with
like
old Pueblo.
Chaco. I mean, the analysis of, was it the room 33 burials that he had, unbelievably interesting and useful. And I think you're going to soon see that kind of data available within the next year or two for Paquimé. I mean, Meredith Snow and Mike Searcy has been doing some amazing work on that, and it's just about ready to be published.
Dave Siegel asked, have you visited sites in the Boot Heel of New Mexico, and do they resemble the outlying sites closer to Paquimé?
Well, that's very, very interesting. No, we didn't. No, we didn't get that far north. But you know, there is the work in the, there have been work in the Gray Ranch, quite a few Animus phase sites, and they're very, very interesting. So basically, most of the ball courts are that we found are really close to Paquimé. The farther out you get, like 30 kilometers, you don't find ball courts with one exception, but you have them in the Gray Ranch. And so it's what's that relationship? I tend to think that they're kind of emulating. They're kind of far enough away. They're medio kind of related, and they're emulating what's happening at Paquimé. But yes, there is neat stuff in the Gray Ranch. There's been some work done a long time ago, McClooney's work and such. Uh, and again, that's a wonderful thing to look more into.
First of all, the Kidder and the Cosgroves at the Pendleton ruin, which is
Yes,
pretty
yeah.
neat.
There's all kinds of neat stuff in Hidalgo County. But that stuff is pretty old too.
Yeah. Oh, and now we have a couple of questions about Steve Lexon and Chaco, and how your ideas align with Steve's, and whether you think there's much Chaco influence in Paquimé.
No. No. You know, they may be on a meridian. On the other hand, Sarawanakeenia is on the meridian. Um, if you look at the architecture, you look at the ritual structures, you look at a whole variety of things, they're not that similar. And they don't necessarily date. I mean, if Chaco kind of runs out at 1150 and Paquimé is going at 1200 and the big stuff at 1300, are they taking that to hoof them, the elites to hoof themselves down to Paquimé? So I think it's an interesting, clever idea that won't hold up over time. There aren't that many connections. Their connections are with West Mexico, if there are any connections.
Just want to ask, is it safe to drive and visit Paquimé right now?
Sure, I do that all the time. You know, the drug wars move around. The really nasty parts of the drug wars move around when cartels are fighting each other for turf. And so you can actually find out where there are problems. I go down there all the time. I have no problem. You know, if you're worried, just stay in town or to Paquimé or go up to Cueva de Loya, stay in the tourist areas. I've never had any problem. Oh, somebody once stole a sandwich and a pair of boots out of a truck. And the Mexican stole binoculars out of my truck. And that's it over 30, 40 years. So I have no problem. You know, just stay in places where people go. I'd rather go to Paquimé than Chicago.
Here's a nice note from Susan Ashton says, thank you, fascinating. I worked at Casas Grandes report in the late 60s under Dr. DePeso and Gloria Finner. So I'm always interested in
Wow.
Paquimé.
Well, thank you. You know, Gloria's still chugging away and living in Tucson.
Yeah,
It's
I
an
saw,
amazing report. Go ahead.
no, I visited Gloria about a month ago. She's still going.
It's hard to overstate how incredible the Casas Grandes project was, and how incredible the report is. It's just unbelievable. I would have shot myself going crazy if I had to do that. I mean, it's a testament to their quality as scholars. And the only reason we can disagree with them is because they put the data out, which is, I think a very strong statement about their ethics as archaeologists and scientists.
Got a question from somebody named Alan Dart. Who says, when you say Paquimé is a regional
Oh,
center or
yeah.
phenomenon, do you mean that its influence was more limited geographically than some of the more pan-southwestern quote unquote cultures like ancestral Pueblo, Mogollon, Hohokam?
Well, let's think about Salado as something, that maybe is more equivalent. I mean, clearly the Casas Grande tradition has a constellation of things and ideas that are ritual, political, etc., economic. And it has a wide distribution. And the question is Paquimé at the cause that wide distribution, or was the wide distribution there and Paquimé grew out of that tradition? And that's not exactly clear. You can look at it both ways. Especially since we can say that the really fancy stuff at Paquimé is 100 years after the period begins. And so it's a regional relation. There's a set of regional relationships, but it's not clear exactly when they developed and how they developed themselves. Same thing. I mean, 20 years ago, everybody was arguing what the heck's a Salado. I mean, we're sort of at that level with Paquimé. But now with a better understanding of the data, we have multiple potential scenarios we have to consider and try to decide which ones make more sense. I don't know, Al, did that answer your question?
Yeah. That's good.
Okay.
John Polo has had his hand up for a while and wanting to talk. Al, do you want to?
Okay, I didn't see that. Yeah, sure. Let me unmute. I can find my participants window. Okay, John, unmute and go ahead.
I accidentally hit the hand button. I had my question answered.
Okay.
Satisfactorily?
What's that?
Satisfactorily?
Yeah. I'm encouraged that you're interested in West Mexico. Let's leave it at that.
And my ignorance is fully obvious. No, it's clear that West Mexico, of all those outside influences, the most important one is West Mexico. The question is that we probably reject is that it was, West Mexico is responsible for the founding of Paquimé. It's clear there are relationships there, and I think a number of us would disagree what the nature of those, but you at least define what they are instead of Chaco, which I think is just such a minor relationship.
I don't know anyone who's actually suggested that West Mexico, or more specifically the Aztlan culture, founded Paquimé.
I think Mathiowicz has
suggested
argued that, hasn't he? I think Mathiowicz argued that it could have been some individuals going up and setting up Paquimé, just like Lexon argues it could be Chaco elites. Am I mistaken about that?
Well, he may. I don't know. I work very closely with him, but I wasn't aware that he'd specifically said that. The way we were kind of looking at all of this was that there is a local population. It does have its own background, and then there are two influences. One coming from you don't like the term Mogollon, but the Mimbres area is drawn in as well as West Mexico, so that it becomes a kind of an international port of trade or center from that perspective. Not to suggest a De Peso kind of Pochteca model in any way, but that there are actually three operatives involved here: a local population together with a northern Chihuahua, southern New Mexico population, together with the sense of eliteness coming out of the Mesoamerican Aztlan tradition. But that's just sort of the way
I mean, I would agree there. Well, actually, I think I'm the only person that's worked in Mimbres and Paquimé, and I must say, I don't see a whole lot. In fact, I did a PowerPoint on that years ago talk, and I don't think there's that much Mimbres quote influence which is odd because they're right next to each other. The Viejo and the Mimbres, we have sites that seem to be Viejo and Mimbres components. So I don't see Mimbres as being a particularly important progenitor for the Casas Grandes tradition.
Well, where would the Mimbres people have gone then? Isn't there an abandonment of Mimbres?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think the system collapsed.
Yeah.
Peggy Nelson and those folks would argue that they spread out, particularly up into the Black Range, for example. And some of them became the Black Mountain face, which is almost kind of like a proto Paquimé, proto Medio period.
Uh-huh.
I don't think that I don't, you know, the number of people coming into Paquimé during the Medio period is best in relationship to the isotope studies, at least, is about the same as the Viejo. So people are moving back and forth. I mean, that's not surprising, shouldn't surprise any of us. But
yeah,
it doesn't seem to be this dramatic influx of outsiders.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you make of Meredith Snow's recognition lately of some DNA evidence of even San Luis Potosi all the way to even Oaxaca or Colombia having a profile in that genetic composition?
Well, she published that yet?
Well, no, she reported on
Because
it at the Chihuahua conference a few months ago.
Yeah, I was there. I don't remember. But she and Mike Cersei are going to be publishing very soon their data. Now they have to redo it a bit because there was a little error. A student of Meredith's made an error, and they have to recalculate some of the stuff. But you know, when it gets published, I'll look at it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you
But,
very
you know,
much. I
I
appreciate the
I mean,
conversation.
yeah, the DNA
Okay.
is really, really important. I mean, it's the same thing like the Room 30 at Pueblo Bonito. They show a matriline that was particularly important for what, Bill? 500 years, 400 years?
Yeah.
200,
How many?
200 maybe.
That's pretty amazing. Multiple generations. And, you know, it could be something similar for Paquimé. I don't know. The DNA is going to be
Good.
really, really valuable data.
Well, I think everybody's looking forward to that, but I think we're going to wrap this up now. So on behalf of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, I really want to thank Paul for sharing with us this evening. I also thank all of you in the audience for joining us tonight. And I want you to please consider making a donation to support Old Pueblo's efforts to educate children and adults about archaeology, history, and cultures, including through programs like this one. So thank you all, and good night.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Bill. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Good night.
Good night.